Welcome back. Here is a little bit of a different video for me, but it's sticking with the recent theme of amplifiers. So this video is about the rebuild of a rather unique amp. I rebuilt this a little earlier in the year, put everything together, and thought I would go over it. It's something called a Gibson BR3, which is from the 1940s. So for a quick backstory on this amp, this actually belongs to a longtime friend of mine. Back when we were in high school and just getting into guitars, this had been given to him. It was his grandfather's. We plugged it in, we heard a loud buzz, and we immediately turned it off, and ever since, really, we didn't do very much with it. I think he tried a few things, but it really never did anything. Thankfully, when he and I did our little experiment of trying to play it, we didn't hurt ourselves. I think we probably could have been seriously injured had we started taking things apart. In the meantime, I have learned a lot about tube amps and how to build them, as well as other electronics. So fast forward about 25 years, I made the proposal that I take a look at it and see if I can get this thing back to life. He and I never heard the amp. All we knew was that it looked cool. And by the end of this video, I think you'll see this turned out to be a pretty amazing amplifier. So I'll talk a little bit about the amp, what I did, and then we'll get to hear some sounds. So as far as I can tell, the BR3 amp is something that accompanied the BR3 lap steel guitar. Usually it came covered in tweed, and they probably made less than 100 of them. As you can see from this picture, someone removed the tweed and stained the wooden cabinet. It actually looks pretty nice, and there definitely have been some modifications way before I ever cut into it. So it was my goal to get this thing up and running, but also maybe do a few updates since it wasn't original, and basically it was functioning as a piece of furniture. I thought it would be great to make this thing really work. I don't think Gibson actually made this amp. I believe they put their name on it. It was probably made by National, which was pretty common in those days. You can see the chassis sits in the back of the cabinet. It's very simple, nothing too fancy. Stock, it has 7 tubes. It runs off a pair of 6 V6s, has 3 preamp tubes, and then 2 rectifiers. We'll take a look at the schematic in a second, but now you can see here's a close-up picture. You've got 3 inputs, 2 that are for instrument, 1 located there that says microphone. You've got 2 volumes, and you have 1 tone knob. In effect, this is very close to the 57 Deluxe schematic. It's just a little earlier. In examining the speaker, we see the first set of modifications that must have taken place on this amp many years ago. Based on the fact that it has 2 rectifier tubes, it should have had a field coil speaker, which is not there. Instead, it has a standard Alnico magnet speaker that's a Utah. I think before I jump into the repair, it's a good idea to take a look at the original schematic. As you look here, you can see that there are 3 preamp stages, and there's an inner stage transformer that functions as the phase inverter. All the tubes are 8-pin, and there basically is a channel for instruments, which really has 2 preamp stages, and then the microphone, which has 3. In addition, because it originally was supposed to have a field coil speaker, that field coil likely was going to function as a choke for the filtering. And without that, there's a high probability of some buzz. As I said, the schematic looks a lot like a 57 Deluxe. As a matter of fact, it even has a few what we call upgrades that might give it a little bit more of a Marshall tone. So, for sure I was going to have to go through and change out the capacitors, but I thought maybe I would take a look and see if there are any improvements that I could make. So to summarize what we're looking at here, we've got 2 channels. One is labeled instruments, the other for microphone. The microphone channel has 3 preamp stages, while the instrument has 2. And the design is pretty close to the 57 Deluxe, which is a legendary amp by Fender. It also has 2 6V6s working in push-pull. And there are 2 rectifiers, but the rectifier that's really supplying the B+ is a 5Z4. So you really get some nice sag out of this amp. In the preamp stage, you're looking at some Lochtel tubes, 7B4s, which basically are triodes that have the same amplification factor as a 12AX7. 12AX7 is still the standard preamp tube used in Marshalls and everything else that's super powerful. Also has a 6J5 tube that has about a 20 as an amplification factor. That's pretty close to a 12AU7. Just as a side note, I thought I would mention that the 7B4 tubes are plentiful and quite inexpensive. So if you're doing an amp project, you might think about utilizing these. I think I paid $3 a tube as opposed to the $15 to $30 a tube you pay for a 12AX7. Much like a Fender 57 Deluxe, this amp is also cathode biased. So with the tube complement and with the output tubes, I was expecting at the least to get something very similar to a 57 Deluxe, but was quite pleasantly surprised to find out not only can it be that, but it can be a lot more. Alright, so the first task at hand, which is something you should do on just about any vintage amp you work on, is to go through and change the capacitors. Capacitors last about 30 to 40 years if you're lucky, and they almost always leak. We're looking at about a 70-year-old amp, so this needed to be changed. This was done for all capacitors, the filtering caps, the bypass caps, and everything else, including the coupling caps. I will say that with the coupling caps, I did a little bit of an upgrade. The standards were 0.05. I went to 0.022, which allows the use of humbuckers without everything going into oscillation and farting out. And looking at this picture, you can see the filter caps. They're pretty big, and I think at the time that was the only option they really had. They also used a can cap in order to do the bypass caps for each one of the cathodes in the preamp. And here's a nice picture of the coupling caps that I removed. You can see they are the old wax type. There's no chance they were any good. And I've replaced all of them with orange drops, as you'll see in a few pictures going forward. Here's a nice shot of the underside of the can cap. I wound up putting in a new style can cap to handle some of this, and for the others I put in smaller capacitors. You'll see some pictures here in a minute. Here's a nice shot of the brand new multi-section can cap, and also another shot of a 10 microfarad, which is part of the bias bypass. As you might expect, things are a little bit smaller and way better quality than they were back in the 1940s. Here's a shot of one of the new coupling caps, and here's another. This kind of gives you a better idea. You can also see that I have replaced the can cap in the second picture there. The coupling caps were fairly easy, but when it got to the filtering caps, it was a little more complicated. It was quite messy looking inside, and someone had gone through and tried to make some changes that were not done very well at some point in the history of this amp. For the filtering section, I beefed things up a bit since there's no choke involved. And when it came to the microphone channel, I decided to combine the B plus with the same B plus that is running on the instruments. I'm not sure why, but the filtering was way less for the microphone channel in stock format, and somebody had doctored this and really butchered this up. I chose to stick with the tried and true formula that Fender had been coming out with since the 50s, and I think it turned out pretty nice. These pictures kind of give an idea of how I utilized modern smaller caps on a terminal strip and tried to get everything lined up. You'll see there's a little extra space under the board now, which is to be expected. From that earlier picture you saw those 20 microfarad caps were giant. In addition to the capacitors, I also added a modern 3-prong plug so that nobody gets electrocuted. I had to put a new on-off switch in there. And I also put in a new Loctile tube socket. There was one that was questionable, and I thought, why not just quickly change this up and eliminate any possibility of problems. Prior to firing it up, here's a final bottom side view. So here is a top side view of the final assembled chassis. You'll notice that I put an output transformer on this chassis, which is not the way it's set up when it's stock, but I needed to do some testing using an external speaker. The output transformer for this amp sits on the speaker basket, and it wasn't practical at the time. And of course, now for the moment of truth, it's time to start it up. You can see here, I'm sorry for the bad video quality, but everything lit up and turned on. And if you listen carefully, you can hear some sound coming out of the speaker. I really was just testing it by touching the tip of the cord. I don't think that my dog was quite the big fan. And now for the maiden voyage. Fingers crossed, here goes. Alright, so it worked, and I made a lot of noise that didn't sound any good. But the one thing that was for sure was it probably could benefit from the use of a master volume, which probably generates a little controversy, but since it was already in a shape that was not original, I didn't see any harm in putting one in. Although I wasn't too concerned about anything staying original, I did decide to use what I think is the simplest, the Trainwreck Type 3 master volume. It's 1 meg, pot, 2 wires, easy to put in and easy to remove if needed. You can also test it to see what it sounds like before you actually use, as you can see I've done here with the alligator clips. I decided to locate it right beside the power tubes, right in the center above one of the volumes. It was a very easy install. Put a chicken head knob on there. So in the end, this is the final schematic for the amp. It's got a master volume. You can see I fixed that B+ rail for the preamp tubes. If you're working on one of these amps or something like this and you'd like a copy of this schematic, let me know. It's pretty simple and I'll make it available to you. So now just for a quick summary of the repair, we have new filter caps, upgraded the mic stage as I talked about, new coupling caps, modified those so they could handle higher output and more treble-based guitar, new cathode bypass caps, new bias caps, a new tube base. The first preamp tube is now biased to match with the others. I didn't talk about that, but I simply needed to change out one of the resistors. I added a Trainwreck Type 3 master volume, put a 3-prong power cord, and of course a new on-off switch. And now it's time to test this out, see what it sounds like. To start with, I'm going to use the 69 Strat that I rebuilt, and we're going to plug it in here and see what we get clean. So we will start out with the instrument channel. The volume is up around 8, and we're going to try to play something that's a bit timely for this kind of guitar. See how Mr. Clapton sounds. I apologize ahead of time for the quality of my playing. I'm sorry about that. And now to clean things up a bit, we'll drop it down to about a 5 on the volume, and we'll go with something squeaky clean from David Gilmour. But this is where this amp all of a sudden surprised me. I grabbed a guitar off the wall that's designed for something a little harder. I plugged into the mic channel. I cranked everything up, although I did take the master volume and drop it down a little bit just to calm things down. And you'll see this is a pretty powerful amp. Here we go. Well, that about does it for the BR3 rebuild. As you can see, it's a pretty versatile amp. You can play quiet and you can play pretty loud. I mean, that's pretty close to Eddie Van Halen's sound. There are no effects pedals. That's straight through the preamp and the 6v6s. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. You'll click like, you'll subscribe, and of course if you have any questions about this, please feel free to let me know. Look forward to hearing from you guys. Thanks a lot.